12,000 BTU portable air conditioners don't really have 12,000 BTUs of cooling capacity. The truth is that portable air conditioners are inefficient. They lose cooling capacity due to their inefficiencies. The two most important inefficiencies are the heat that they add back into the room via ducting and infiltration air. The heat that they add via ducting is simple to understand. The unit has a duct on the back, it exhausts hot air away from the unit, and as it exhausts that hot air, the hose itself heats up. And the hose is normally made of a thin plastic material. Even this hose here on this very high-end unit is made of a thin plastic, and that thin plastic radiates heat quite easily. And so this heat is added back into the room and reduces that 12,000 BTU number because it's adding heat back into the room. The second inefficiency is a little bit more difficult to understand. It involves the unit pulling in air from the room that it is actively working to condition. It pulls in air from that same room to cool its hot parts, most notably its condenser. And as it does so, it doesn't work to replace that air that it's using to cool those parts. So it's pulling in air from the room, it's exhausting that same air out of the room, and at the same time, it's not working to replace that air in any way. So what ends up happening is that it creates an area of low pressure inside of the room being conditioned relative to the outdoors, and the outdoors by extension is at a higher pressure. And so that outdoor air is constantly wanting to get pulled into the room. And that is what we call infiltration air. That outdoor air that is constantly pulled into the room adds heat to the room, and that reduces the overall cooling capacity of the portable air conditioner. So back to our 12,000 BTU units, we have 12,000 BTUs, assuming that that heat added by the ducting and that heat added by infiltration air doesn't do much, is not significant at all, when it really is quite significant. The best way to see this is by looking at the seasonally adjusted cooling capacity for these units. Now, in the past, we would only have these traditional BTU numbers to compare units by. We would have 8,000 BTU units, 10,000 BTU units, 12,000 BTU units, 14,000 BTU units. Within each of those size classes, we would not be able to compare different models within the same size class because they would all be at the same capacity. All 14,000 BTU units would appear to have 14,000 BTUs of cooling capacity. All 12,000 BTU units would appear to have 12,000 BTUs of cooling capacity. However, today we have seasonally adjusted cooling capacity, which is a new metric by which we compare these different units. And seasonally adjusted cooling capacity does take into account those two major inefficiencies that we just talked about. So what ends up happening is that seasonally adjusted cooling capacity not only is a lower number than that traditional number, but it now gives us a much more accurate representation of the actual cooling capacity for these different units. And it also distinguishes between the performance of different units because not all units in the same traditional BTU size class have the same seasonally adjusted cooling capacity. Let's take a look at what we're talking about here. So in the 12,000 BTU category, there are several models represented here. First of all, notice the range of seasonally adjusted cooling capacity. On the high end of the range, we have units around 7,000 to 7,200 BTUs. At the low end of the range, we have units at the 6,500 BTU mark. Now, this is quite a bit of a range here. However, we don't see quite the same variance that we see in other BTU size classes. For example, in the 14,000 BTU size class, we see units with a seasonally adjusted cooling capacity that varies all the way from 7,500 to 10,000 BTUs. So there we see a range of 2,500 BTUs, where the most efficient units have 2,500 more BTUs of seasonally adjusted cooling capacity than the least efficient units. In the 12,000 BTU size class, we only see a range of 700 BTUs. So the least efficient units have 6,500 BTUs and the most efficient units have 7,200 BTUs. So there is less of a range here, but there is a range nonetheless, and there is a distinct difference between the most efficient units and the least efficient units, even in this 12,000 BTU size class. So definitely notice the range here, and also notice how each one of these units have a traditional BTU number that is 12,000 BTUs. If you were to shop for these units in the store and you didn't have that seasonally adjusted cooling capacity number to go by, you would think that all of these units would have the same performance because they all are 12,000 BTU units. However, now that you understand the inefficiencies involved here and you understand the meaning of seasonally adjusted cooling capacity and how it takes into account those inefficiencies, you can see how the better number to go by here is that SACC number, and that is what we're going to use to compare these different units. So at the bottom end of the range, we have units from Honeywell, Frigidaire, and Black & Decker. These units only have 6,500 BTUs of seasonally adjusted cooling capacity. We would not recommend any of those units to a prospective buyer. This is a low number. You are paying for a 12,000 BTU portable air conditioner and you are getting low actual cooling capacity. So these units are not recommended. At the upper end of the range, we have a few models to choose from. Most prominently, we have the Frigidaire FGPC1244T1, and we have the LG LP1217GSR. Now, either one of these units would be a great option if you are trying to stay within the 12,000 BTU category. Both of these units have a high seasonally adjusted cooling capacity for this category. And cooling capacity is going to be the major driving force behind your purchase decision. It's going to be the one factor that separates these units. And the Frigidaire and the LG having a higher seasonally adjusted cooling capacity than the competition here definitely puts them at the forefront of our recommendations. Quite interestingly, the Winter ARC122DS has 6,800 BTUs of seasonally adjusted cooling capacity. And this is interesting because the Winter is actually a dual hose unit. So you would expect a dual hose unit like the Winter to have a better seasonally adjusted cooling capacity because it has less of a infiltration air inefficiency. The reason for that is that its second hose actually pulls in outdoor air to cool the condenser instead of using room air. So there is much less of a pressure gradient that is created in the room when you use a dual hose unit like the Winter. However, looking at these numbers here, it's clear that even despite this advantage, there are several disadvantages to having the dual hoses there that pulls this unit down to 6,800 BTUs. So the Winter would generally not be recommended along with all the other low SACC units in the category. Again, we recommend the Frigidaire and the LG. It should be noted that the Frigidaire is a smart unit, and because it's a smart unit, because it can be used with your phone wirelessly, that does come with an extra cost. The unit is also very large, it's very tall, and it's also very heavy for a 12,000 BTU unit. So if you are trying to buy a 12,000 BTU unit compared to a 14,000 BTU unit because you were trying to buy a smaller or maybe a lighter unit, that's definitely not the case with that Frigidaire. It is actually taller and heavier than most 14,000 BTU units. So keep that in mind with the Frigidaire. Keep in mind that you're going to pay a little bit of a premium to get that smart functionality. But overall, a very good unit in the category. It would be our number one recommendation here. Our number two recommendation would be the LG. If you are budget minded and you are solely focused on getting the best value in the category, the LG is the recommendation. But the overall recommendation here is the Frigidaire.